Hello, this is for third year students. So last time we spoke about the civil rights movement. We tried to make a short summary of the main events, but mainly we talked about the results of this movement and of course after all the different forms of resistance and activism in terms of sit-ins and protests, but also the debate between violent and non-violent resistance. Then we also said that the results, of course, which would lead to the change and also probably the correction of the injustices that the African American community had to endure. We said that these results, of course, are in the form of legislations, but also court rulings or court decisions, decisions by the Supreme Court mainly, but also by other federal decisions and state federal courts and state courts. Sorry, but also in terms, of course, of legislations and new legislations, of course, that granted civil rights to the African American community. So today we're going to move to something else, but it's always related to the Cold War period and also to related to the anti-war movement and also to civil rights movement and all these things. And it's about counterculture, what we would call actually counterculture. And I believe that I personally believe that counterculture is a very broad concept that could include all these movements that we talked about. I believe personally that within what we call counterculture, there is the civil rights movement, there is the anti-war movement, and other movements, including the hippie movement, environmentalism, and all these things. So, because by definition, what's counterculture? Counterculture, of course, is something that is against the dominant culture. It's something that we could say against the mainstream culture. And so I believe that it's better to give the title counterculture to this lecture to include all these new movements that represent a kind of resistance and a kind of rejection of culture, of the dominant culture, and trying to change it, to mend it, not being satisfied with that old culture. This feeling and this tendency and attitude started, and we talked before about this, started after the end of the Second World War, WW2. And I told you, of course, that idea of the generation gap, again, which appears, by the way, historically in the aftermath of every war. People, of course, because, of course, like the famous saying that in war there is no winner or loser, everyone is a loser. So of course, after every war, with all the losses and all the casualties and deaths and miseries, of course, people will start blaming each other or blaming themselves. And the generation, I believe, gap started, mainly became very intense. Like, generation gap, of course, had always existed, but mainly became very high and strong after the Second World War, which meant the idea that I told you, it's probably a little bit funny. It's that the idea that those who go to war are, of course, young men. Those who die in wars because of the fighting, of course, are mainly young men. They are between, let's say, 20 and 30s. 30, sorry, between their 20s and their 30s. Probably some of them, of course, could be 40, etc. But this is, I mean, in general. While the decision makers, which means the senators, congressmen, politicians, the president of the republic, etc. I'm not speaking only about the United States, in general. Of course, they are not in their 20s. They are in their 50s, 60s, or 70s. And here we could speak again about generation gap. Not the generation gap that you have at home, I mean, between the father and the son. This is, of course, in a broader sense in politics. But, of course, it could be general in all aspects of life. And so all these new cultures or subcultures, we also call them, subcultures and these new tendencies and movements. Of course, I believe they are interrelated. When we speak about the anti-war movement, about the civil rights movement, which is also, I believe, a subculture, and it's also, again, it's a counterculture because it is against the dominant culture, the dominant legislation, which was, of course, dominated by racism and racial discrimination, segregation, etc. I think that we could speak about counterculture since the end of the Second World War until the 1960s and 70s, the beginning of the 1970s, I believe. So this is the period of that counterculture of that period. And this was mainly in the United States, but also in other countries in the world, in Britain, of course, and in France, but even in Tunisia, by the way, of course, in the Arab world, etc. We hear when we speak about young people who are not satisfied with their politicians, not satisfied with their decision makers, not satisfied with the public policies of the state, and who are criticizing everything. It's also related to what we could call anti-authoritarian or anti-establishment, anti-establishmentarianism. By the way, this is believed to be the longest word in the English dictionary, in the English language, anti-establishmentarianism, anti-establishmentarianism. It's supposed to be the longest word in the English language. So, well, of course, we cannot speak about everything again. I will be selective again, but you have to read, of course, more than we will talk about in the lecture. You have to read more and more. You have to try to discover about this counterculture. One of the, let's say, one of the movements of this very tiny movement, but it's interesting and it's related also to again, I always relate culture to literature, of course. There was a movement in the late 1950s related to literature. You know, as we said, the generation, the young people of the late 1940s, and also the newborns of the late 1940s, who became young people in the 1960s. They were at their 20s in the 1960s, 70s. So this is the generation of young people that we're speaking about in general. There was a literary movement in America that was called the Beats. In addition to another, of course, let's say, another example of the counterculture, representing counterculture in music, the Beatles, of course, that's also part of the culture of that time, and the Beatles as a music band represented also a kind of counterculture because it represented a kind of modernization of music. The modernization of music and the kind of new music that was not accepted, that was rejected by the old generation who were fond of symphonies and things like that. So there's always that kind of generation gap. This movement was called the Beat, and one of its probably leaders is a poet, an American poet whose name is Allen Ginsberg. I have his poem here. It's called How, and I invite you to read it. Of course, it's available online. This is Howl and Other Poems by Allen Ginsberg. It was published in 1956, to be exact. And then, by the way, it was also prohibited. The publication of this book was prohibited, was censored by the authorities, by the U.S. Customs and the San Francisco police. It was in California. How, in the beginning, from the very beginning of this poem, you can read a lot of ideas about this generation that is not satisfied, as we said, with the dominant culture, with the old culture. The movement of the Beats, capital B, B-E-A-T-S, was also very influential, mainly at university, on campus, and these were students at that time. And another important figure of the movement, and this book speaks about him, by the way. The poem speaks about the other important figure, whose name is Jack Kerouac, and who is also a writer, and who was influential, who had a lot of influence on other writers and on the movement in general. So we speak about counterculture, as we said, as a opposition to the dominant culture, and opposition also to conservatism. We have to say, to the dominant culture, to the mainstream culture, but also to authority, of course, opposition to authority, opposition to old culture that actually resists change, that resists evolution, but also we speak about resistance and opposition to conservatism, to old mores, or mores, M-O-R-E-S, and it means, of course, traditions and customs, and the necessity to evolve, the necessity to change. So a lot of things, a lot of dogmas were put into question during this period by the young generations, and including political dogmas, but also religious dogmas, social dogmas, and customs. This movement, as I said, is also, you could link it, of course, for sure, to the anti-war movement. I started with that, with generation gap related also to the anti-war movement. We spoke about the Vietnam War, and that was the most important war that actually pushed people to protest against the war because of the high rates of casualties, etc. And protests were widespread on campuses, and it became a kind of culture again. It's a subculture of the anti-war. It was in the beginning, of course, probably it was created because of and it came to light because of the Vietnam War. But even after the Vietnam War, as we said, the Vietnam War ended. The U.S. engagement in Vietnam ended in 1973. Even today, of course, there's still that anti-war movement and that anti-war subculture, the idea that we have to reject wars at all costs. That's also part of the counterculture, as I said. And in addition to this anti-war movement and its impact on the culture of the young people, there was a rise in distrust, a rise in lack of trust and lack of confidence in governments, in governance, in governments, in decision makers. So it means that people started to question decision makers and their intentions, not to believe in them, even though, of course, they are democratically elected. And here we could even speak about the rise of conspiracy theories, and conspiracy theories, of course, are a result of the lack of trust in decision makers. That the decision, like today, of course, because of this coronavirus, of course, there are many people who believe in conspiracy theory. Why? Why do they believe? Because, of course, there is lack of trust in decision makers, lack of trust in the people who are pulling the strings, like they say, like a master of puppets. So this was the time when these, I believe, things were born and started to develop. Lack of trust in authority, lack of trust also in police, in law enforcement. And here came, of course, the clashes with law enforcement, confrontation with law enforcement, with the police on campuses, and we could speak about a lot of casualties because of these and a lot of violent events and incidents that took place. Lack of trust was, of course, also fed by and the conspiracy theories and lack of trust because of the assassinations. The assassination of Kennedy, the assassination also of African American leaders, and also there was an important incident that took place. It's just a detail, but I believe it also had a big impact, which was called the Watergate. You have to read about this, by the way. I cannot speak about all the details, but it was about President Richard Nixon, who was also a leader, one of the leaders of the war, the Vietnam War, and it was about spying, and it nourished the feeling of lack of trust and in the government among young people. And Nixon, by the way, was forced to resign. He resigned by the end of his term, towards the end of his term, actually, term of office. He did not actually came out of office just naturally. He resigned, and he, I believe, was the only president, the only U.S. president to resign. The lack of trust that I was speaking about again could also be connected to the atmosphere of McCarthyism of the 1950s that we talked about. Of course, witch hunt, and people were panicking and afraid of being accused of treason, communism and treason, etc. So that's also, I believe, it's a contribution to the atmosphere of lack of trust, lack of peace of mind, and lack of harmony within society. Society was divided, and I told you, as a result of the Vietnam War, there was a big division, a critical division in the American society because of that. Don't forget that the Cold War was also a war of espionage, of spying, of lack of trust again. So, and we could go into details to speak, for example, about real spies who were discovered, I mean, by both sides, by the USSR and also by the USA. Americans who are Americans, not Russians, but who were discovered to be spies and who were caught red-handed, like they say, and they were actually prosecuted and imprisoned or executed sometimes. Yeah, so some of the cases. And what I wanted to make, the point that I wanted to make here is that you could see, I hope you agree with me, that all these incidents and all these items contributed to the feeling of lack of trust in the government, in the decision makers, in the authority, in the establishment itself, in the system, like we say, and also in law enforcement and clash with authorities. And people start to believe that there is a kind of hegemonic power that is governing everybody. And here, of course, they started to defend minority rights because they believed that the majority was dominant and was persecuting the minorities. And this is also part of the counterculture in the US. Minority rights. And when we speak about minority rights, of course, you could think about all the possible minorities, including African Americans first, but also including women, including Latins, Latinos, Asians. And today we could also include Muslims and Arabs. And the idea that these groups of people, these minorities, of course, are not enjoying their full rights in the United States of America, and there is the dominant WASP minority, and that we need, of course, to be active in order to defend full rights and full justice and full equality between all these minorities and these groups. So, as I said, this was the generation of the post-WW2. And after WW2, we have to say that there was a moment, in addition, of course, to McCarthyism and that atmosphere of witch hunt, there was also a moment of economic prosperity, relative economic prosperity after the war in the US. And this led naturally to an increase in birth rates, what they call the baby boom. Baby boom, which means a significant increase in birth rates, in fertility rates, and this would, of course, even reinforce the generation gap. We're going to have big numbers of young people later in 2 decades, which when we say, of course, a bigger number. A larger number of young people, it meant, of course, more important power, more important strength and force. So these young people, in addition to the classic ideas that I talked about, anti-war feeling, the minority rights, there were also other movements. And there were other expressions of counterculture, including the hippie culture. What's the hippie culture? By the way, the hippie culture was also influenced by the Beats that I talked about and Allen Ginsberg. This was, of course, a very interesting movement that appeared in the United States around the 1960s and 1970s. Who were these people? These young people, of course. Again, they were against the system, against the establishment, and they tried to actually express that even in the way they dressed up. The long hair and probably the non-casual dress with blue jeans and avoiding the wearing of suits, or classic dress, and sometimes not even given a lot of importance to looks, being informal most of the time, sometimes being even dirty. So unconventional dress in general, of course, you can find a lot of examples online of pictures of how they were dressed up, and also a kind of easygoing lifestyle that tries to, let's say, advocate belief in tolerance and coexistence between, regardless of the differences, etc. Because, of course, these young people, felt that there was a lot of rejection, a lot of intolerance, a lot of hostility between the different groups in the United States of America. So they believed in the opposite, and they tried to promote the opposite. They tried to promote peace. They tried to promote coexistence, etc., with a very famous, by the way, slogan that they had: make love, do not make war. And make love also, of course, had a sexual connotation, and there was also what we could call a sexual revolution that took place, and it's also part of the counterculture of the period, sexual revolution. And we need also to talk a little bit about what it meant and what kind of ideas it defended. But before that, these people, the hippies, of course, as we said, they conducted a kind of unconventional lifestyle. They lived in groups, of course, of people who believed in the same ideals, in communes, that they were called communes, and they believed in They also believed in vegetarianism, in organic food. They believed in environmentalism. They believed that we need to protect the environment, and that the human being is doing a lot of harm to the environment, pollution, etc., of course, and that we need to stop that. So they are also connected to the green movement and environmentalism, and they try to express that, of course, in by consuming non-processed food, organic food, and by being vegetarian. Because, by the way, being vegetarian and vegetarianism does not only rely on the belief that we don't need to kill animals, and that it is rather brutal to kill animals and to cut the throat of sheep, etc. That's, of course, one of the arguments. But another argument is that consuming animals is also very harmful to the environment and to nature. So these people also had a lot of clashes with the police, with law enforcement, because of their lifestyle. Of course, they were rejected by the dominant culture and by the authorities because of what they defended, and because of how they looked. And there were a lot of clashes, a lot of protests, and a lot of violent incidents between them and law enforcement, and a lot of arrests. They were sometimes accused of vagrancy. Vagrant person means somebody who is homeless and who lives in the streets. And that's, by the way, of course, maybe some people do not know it. That's, of course, let's say, not a crime, but it's a violation of the law, which means a crime, a petty crime. To be vagrant and to live in the streets, that's also, of course, something illegal, whether in Tunisia or in other countries. And they also, economically speaking, they led a kind of what we could call cooperatives. You know, we have in Tunisia very interesting experience with cooperatives, which means, of course, it's rather, of course, a socialist method, a socialist system of living, and as an economic socialist system. And they believed in nonviolence, in peace, as I said, and uh, they uh, they believed also in spiritualism, and they were some of them, at least a significant portion of them, rejected what we could call organized religion. They were not necessarily irreligious. They were not necessarily non-believers. Not necessarily. Some of them were, of course, but they rejected mainly organized religion, which meant, of course, the institution of religion. Not religion as a belief, but the institution of religion itself. When we speak about religion as an organized system, as an organized institution with representatives and with an organization, etc. But they believe in spiritualism. Spiritualism is often opposed to or put into in opposition with organized religion. Spiritualism is to believe in spiritual existence, but without exercising, without observing any religion, without praying, for instance, conventionally according to the teachings of one organized religion. Well, in addition to, of course, their belief in spiritualism, environmentalism, in addition also to their belief in pacifism, they were also connected to kind of musical style. Of course, as I told you before about the Beatles, but also other bands like the Rolling Stones and the Who, etc. So they also had their own music, which was also a counterculture music. It was also a music that is innovative, and that's probably, we could call it experimental at that time. Experimental, when we describe something as experimental, it means that it is trying new things. And at that time, yes, this music that I'm talking about was new and was revolutionary, was something that is also rejected by the canon, by conservatism. We could also speak here about another culture, the Bob Marley culture, of course, the Rasta culture, the reggae music, which also more or less defended the same ideals, lifestyle, belief also in peace, belief in tolerance, belief in coexistence, etc. So, as I said, the Rolling Stones, the Who, the Beatles, in addition to Jimi Hendrix. By the way, there was also a very interesting event that took place, actually, and it's still remembered today, a very huge concert. They had, of course, open air concerts. They used to organize open air concerts, and the biggest was called the Woodstock Festival, the Woodstock series. It was a series of concerts in Woodstock, and it was an rural area of New York. And here, they say that there were about 500,000 people. Imagine that. Of course, it was open air, and it lasted 3 days of non-stop music. And among the bands, they were mainly, of course, they were probably rock and roll bands. And they included people like Jimi Hendrix. They included also people like The Who, like Carlos Santana. At that time, he was not that famous. And it was really a very memorable event at that time, the Woodstock Festival. There were some attempts later to repeat the same experience. And it was really something unprecedented, and one of the expressions of this hippie movement, as I said. Now, concerning the sexual revolution that I mentioned before, well, one of the movements and one of the expressions of the counterculture, and also embraced by the hippie movement and by the young generations of the time, was what we could call a sexual revolution. You could imagine here that we are speaking again about rejection of old norms, of mores, of traditions when it comes to to sexuality, to the body. There was what was called we by the way, the expressions of these ideas, and we could be found of course in protests, in activism, but also in literature, and also but also in books, in poems, in novels, etc., but also in some writings, philosophical, intellectual writings, theories by famous intellectuals of the time, etc. So there is a lot of there is a lot of material to be read and to be explored with every single movement that I mentioned. So concerning the sexual revolution, there was also what was called the celebration of the body, that the body, the idea that the body was or had been shackled for centuries, and the human body, of course, had been shackled, had been actually in bondage for centuries and centuries. It is high time, it was at that time high time to emancipate it, to release it from this bondage. This was, of course, expressed in a lot of texts, of course, as I said, in philosophical texts, intellectual texts, and in addition to music, poetry, etc. The idea that we need to celebrate the body, that also that we should not be ashamed of sex, of sexual intercourse, and that those bonds and those probably rules that are imposed on recreational sex were useless and need to be removed. What they called recreational, the belief in recreational sex, recreation, which means, of course, entertainment, as opposed probably to what we could call procreational sex, sex for procreation against sex for recreation. What's procreation? Procreation means production, to produce babies, of course. Reproductive sex, and procreational sex, which was, of course, defended by the church, defended by religious people, that you could only, this is mainly in Christianity, that normally you should not engage in sex if it is not meant for procreation. It is not, if it is not meant for the reproduction of new babies. So otherwise it would not be justified, and it would probably be illicit, not accepted, not allowed. So that was, of course, a dominant belief. And this counterculture defended the opposite. It believed in the possibility of recreational sex, and defended this idea. Of course, recreational sex could be associated with other movements, philosophical movements, that like hedonism, what we call hedonism, hedonism, and I invite you to discover the meaning of this concept. Hedonism, bohemianism, bohemia, you know, like in the very famous French song La Bohème, which speaks, of course, about life of freedom, life of young people who are set free, etc. Hedonism and bohemianism, and belief in art, belief in the pleasures of the flesh also, and belief in all sorts of freedom, intellectual freedom and also physical freedom, so if so to speak. By the way, I told you that this poem, for instance, one of the poems that were censored, that were actually prohibited by the authorities, so you can understand here that it was not really an atmosphere of free speech like today, if so to speak. If we believe today we have free speech, you know, with McCarthyism mainly, of course, censorship was very high. And you know that a lot of authors and a lot of intellectuals were prosecuted because of McCarthyism in the 1950s. And just to give you an idea that the atmosphere was not an atmosphere of total free speech, and that there were red lines set by the authorities, and that there was censorship. So one of the movements was a movement to defend free speech, the free speech movement, of course, and it is connected to these freedoms, total freedoms that I told you about, including intellectual and physical freedom. The sexual revolution was also a challenge of the marital institution, because marriage, as you know, is an institution. It's a social institution that's legalized by law, etc. And it's a conventional, traditional, legal, conservative institution, and these young people were against this establishment. It's another establishment, of course, the what we call the marriage institution. They also defended, some of them defended the recreational use of drugs, including the marijuana drug. Of course, today still the debate is going on about legalizing marijuana, and marijuana was classified by the authorities as a narcotic, as something to be banned. And there is a movement, I believe, that still exists today that takes as a slogan, legalize it. And so they also believed that they had the right to use some kinds of drugs, some kinds of narcotics for recreational purposes again. And of course, this movement mainly, as I said in the beginning, was very important in the US, but it was widespread. It was in the world. I mean, it was if you ask, for example, your fathers and mothers, they will tell you in Tunisia that, of course, not with all the details that I talked about, but it had a lot of influence here in Tunisia. Our former generations used to have, for example, long hair and a kind of fashionable, stylish clothes that are not conventional, in addition to, of course, other forms and other details that you could, of course, detect by trying to also study the Tunisian culture of the 1960s and 1970s. Well, I believe that I try to give you a general summary of all the movements that were connected to what we could call counterculture. Of course, there are a lot of things more things to say, and here, of course, we have I have to tell you that I just wanted again to give you a summary. An introduction, a very brief, a very short introduction, a very simplified introduction to this movement. If you want to discover more, of course, you have to read. Again, I can send you books and articles to read more about these movements. And for example, one of them here, well, this is not a PDF and it cannot be sent, but it's a very interesting book. It's called American Dreams. It speaks about the period of the Cold War after World War II until, of course, the 1990s in the US, in a very literary way, by the way. It's not just a historical account. It speaks about history and it speaks about historical events, but in a literary way. And the style is very entertaining in addition to being instructive. So, So to recapitulate probably and to list again these movements, so we spoke about the counterculture movement, that I believe personally it is rather an umbrella movement, and it included the anti-war movement, it included the hippie movement, environmentalism, the environmentalist movement, spiritualism, the New Left. Also, probably I did not mention the New Left, which was a revival of interest in leftist ideas. Because, of course, I believe that it goes without saying that these movements and these ideals and principles are in a mesh with, in harmony with leftist ideas of liberation, of freedom, etc. But of course, with some reform, it's not pure communism of the USSR or of China, of course. So, but there you can connect it, you can associate it with a little bit, at least, with the left. And there was a movement, an interest in leftist ideas by young people, political interest in leftist ideas, and it was called the New Left, also capital N, capital L. So, as I said, anti-war, New Left, the hippie movement, the Beats, environmentalism, spiritualism, and so I believe that all these movements, all these tendencies were against the establishment, against the authority, the old authority, the conservative traditional authority, and this is why I believe they could be grouped under the umbrella term, the counterculture. This is my conclusion. Thank you very much. See you next time.